the next session, we're going to talk about our health and wellbeing section for the next hour. And we've got some fantastic speakers that have come to talk to us today about very different topics. The first speaker that we've got is Jo Brewis. Now, I don't want to steal any of her thunder, but just to introduce her, she's going to talk about her research and menopause. And this was fascinating, the work that's been done there. And I think in the South Yorkshire region, from a health perspective, we've done lots and lots of work to really embed menopause across our system. And I think we've even been award-winning in the work that we've done, which credit to Brigitte Caviani and the team and the local teams, reaching out to thousands and thousands of people across all systems to really start talking about menopause and the impact on individuals. We've had a couple of festivals. That's been fantastic, really well attended, with lots of activities and support and showcasing and insights into people experience. And that's what this is about, sharing that experience, sharing learning, continuing to learn together. Now, menopause isn't going to go away. It's been a slow and steady build over a number of years, but I think Jo will go on to talk about the research and what she's found. But I think when we just think about where it's going in the future, there's going to be more responsibility for employers and workforces and teams to have guidance and training and adjustments, both from an occupational health perspective, but also in the workplace and been active within that. So I think it's going to be a fantastic session. I've listened to Jo before, and we were really keen to get her to come back because she just really embeds the importance of this very good topic. So without further ado, I'm not going to keep waffling on. We're a few minutes ahead of schedule, but Jo, that gives you probably a couple of minutes to introduce yourself further, but I'll hand over a warm welcome to Jo Brewis. Thanks, Jo.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was a really, really sweet introduction. Happy International Women's Day, everybody, for yesterday. And as Sarah says, I have been working on menopause as a workplace issue with a very wide range of collaborators for 10 years now. We initially started this work because we were awarded a commission to write an evidence review for what was then the Government Equalities Office. It's now the Office for Equality and Opportunity. And it really is the project that just keeps on giving. I don't think we had any idea how long it would endure. Just when we think it's gone to sleep, it wakes back up again. And it's been, I think, easily the most stimulating and important work I've ever done. And I really hope, and I think to some extent, that this is also the first time that I think my research has actually made a positive difference in the world, as opposed to just being read by a handful of other old dusty academics. So let's move on then, folks, if we can. Could we? Oh, thank you. There's my intro slide. So as Sarah says, what I'm going to talk about is the latest research in terms of menopause as a workplace issue. If anybody wants to get in touch afterwards, you've got my email there. And as you can see, I work at the Open University Business School. So could we move on, please? Thank you. So I'm going to start with some headline figures from a very brief report, which is publicly available if you're interested. And it was produced by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development and the Society of Occupational Medicine last year. And it's about women's health, or more specifically, women's reproductive health in general as a workplace issue. So they also talk about menstruation, they talk about gynecological conditions like endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome. But in terms of what the report tells us about menopause in particular and its connection to the workplace, one statistic that it cites is that through unemployment alone, so through women losing their jobs or walking away from their jobs because they're struggling with their menopausal symptoms, the UK economy loses £1.5 billion every year because of this issue alone. And there are lots of other issues that menopause can create at work. It's very important to suggest that it doesn't always, and numbers of people who go through menopause will not have a particularly problematic experience. But for those who do, It's costly on a personal level, and it's costly on an organisational level, as well as at the level of the economy. We also know, as this report tells us, that 75% or 3/4 of women between the age of 40 and 60, which is the relatively typical menopausal range, people do have menopause much earlier than that, but this is the typical age range, that they will experience symptoms. And the best guesstimates suggest that 25% will have symptoms that actually really get in the way of them enjoying life, and that includes life at work. I think it's also important to remember that while symptoms can make work quite a miserable place to be, work can also exacerbate symptoms. So it can be a bit of a vicious circle, and I'll come back to that later on. We also know that 67% of women suggest that menopause causes some difficulty for them at work, that in some way it discommodes them, and that could be embarrassment through hot flushes or menstrual flooding. It could be issues with your concentration or your memory, which make it difficult to focus, and losing self-confidence in terms of actually having to constantly check and recheck your work. We can also think about psychological symptoms like anxiety or depression or mood swings, which again really affect women's self-belief at work and can affect their sense of professionalism. So it isn't just about the fact that it creates discomfort. We also know, and again, there's lots of good evidence to this effect now, that problematic menopausal symptoms at times can make it difficult to come to work altogether. There's lots of evidence about women taking menopause-related absence, but not necessarily feeling able to tell anybody that that's why they're off sick. They may cloak the reason in something else. It certainly affects confidence, as I've suggested. And performance is an interesting one because there's a kind of assumption, I think, in general, that as you get older, and perhaps specifically around being menopausal, that somehow that will have an automatically negative effect on your performance. And actually, the jury's still out on that one. The evidence is very mixed. There is evidence to say that menopause can affect your performance, but it's important to go back to the fact that a lot of the research on performance is based on self-report. In other words, it's women telling researchers that they think their performance has been affected. And actually, if you consider that menopause can really dampen your self-confidence, it's probably no surprise that a lot of those data do suggest a negative impact on performance. So I think we need to be a little bit careful there. And I'll come back to that issue later on. Could we move on, please? Thank you. So we got some very interesting headline figures there from the CIPD, who've been very active in the menopause arena, as have the Society of Occupational Medicine. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to concentrate on a piece of work that I did for menopause-friendly accreditation, which is actually how Sarah and I hooked up in the first place, because as she said, she was at an event that MFA ran last September and saw me talk about very similar things to the ones that I'm talking about today. So I'm an independent panel member for menopause friendly accreditation. And last year, Deborah, who's the CEO, and her team commissioned me to pick up on where we left off with the Government Equality Office review. So that review spanned from January 1990 to March 2016. So my poor maths tells me 25, 26 years there. And we were commissioned to find English language evidence which looked at the connection between menopause at work, menopause and work, I should say. And that report covered about 104 publications. So it was very bulky. It took us a long time. And there was also a lot of sifting. We had to be quite careful about what we included and what we didn't. We only wanted to include evidence, whether it was academic peer-reviewed evidence or very strong grey literature that's produced by people like the government or professional bodies like the CIPD. But what is really interesting is that looking now at this systematic review that I did, which basically brought the GEO report up to date, we can see just how much more evidence there is now about menopause as a workplace issue. So for the 26 years for the GEO report, And the 8 years for the evidence review that I did last year, you can see that I found more than 130 publications that I deemed to be robust enough and reliable enough to include in this review for Deborah and the team. And I think that shows something very important. It shows that we have really woken up to menopause as a workplace issue, particularly in the UK. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the UK is a real pioneer in the world in this particular area. We can also think about changing demographics, which means that women and other people who go through menopause in midlife are either coming back to work or staying in work in greater numbers. We're seeing legal cases increase. We've seen legislative changes, which I'll come back to later. We've also seen these statistics, for example, the 1.5 billion figure around the economic cost of menopause. And for me, it's also just the right thing to do to support your menopausal staff and increase their quality of working life. So this evidence review covered a lot more publications, something, 20 or 30 more publications over a shorter period of time. The publications that I looked at included both quantitative, so numerical and statistical evidence, and qualitative evidence, the sort of evidence you might get from an interview or a focus group. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I do think that this review gives us the most up-to-date picture in terms of the research that we have and the knowledge that we've gained about menopause as a workplace issue. So could you move me on? And I'm just going to plug my laptop in case it fails. Okay. So a lot of the evidence that I looked at last year, the more recent evidence, said very similar things to the ones that we were finding when we were working on the government report during 2016 and 2017. But there were some things that were new, or at least things that hadn't changed. So some of these are good things, some of these aren't so positive. The first thing that I definitely saw, and I'm very pleased that this is happening, is that menopause in the workplace research has now a much greater focus on inclusion and intersectionality. And what I mean by that is that there is research now which really takes seriously the fact that menopause is not a one size fits all experience. It's unique to everybody who goes through it. And it's also affected or influenced by particular identity characteristics. So, for example, there's a lot more emphasis now on the connection between menopausal symptoms and neurodiversity, and how if you're neurodiverse and you're going through the menopause and struggling with it, that can make life even harder at work. We also see a lot more attention being paid to how various forms of disability intersect with menopausal symptoms at work. We see a lot more emphasis on race and ethnicity as intersectional characteristics, which may influence your experience of symptoms at work. And we're also seeing much more evidence on gender. And as I said before, the fact that not everybody who goes through menopause identifies as a woman. If you have ovaries, you will go through menopause. That's simply a kind of biological reality, if you like. So that's one thing that's new. There's very much a more variegated and more diverse picture, trying to include everybody who goes through menopause and really take account of how different experiences can be. What we're also seeing in the workplace research is a lot more emphasis on bidirectionality. Now, that's just a fancy academic way of saying that issue about the vicious circle that I was talking about earlier. So, of course, we know that symptoms can make work a more miserable place to be, but there's now much more emphasis on how work can affect symptoms and really honestly make them worse in many cases. So there's a lot more emphasis on temperature and ventilation and how those can exacerbate hot flushes. There's emphasis on how noise in the workplace can really exacerbate issues around memory and concentration and also anxiety. There's a lot more evidence around workwear and uniforms, and particularly, and this won't surprise anyone on the call, given that I know there's a lot of NHS people here, a lot of emphasis on PPE. And that in particular, I think, got a lot of attention during and after the pandemic. Some of the struggles that people have to wear very bulky, uncomfortable PPE, which often isn't designed for women's bodies. So not only is it cumbersome and hot, it also can be uncomfortable in the sense that it's designed for a male body. There's also a lot more emphasis on how different sorts of jobs can be particularly difficult to inhabit during menopause. So, for example, if you're in a job where you don't have very much autonomy, or you're in a job where there's a lot of deadlines, or you're in a job where the hours are very rigid, then again, all of these things have been shown to have an exacerbating effect on menopause symptoms. Something else that's very positive, I think, is that we're also much more aware now of how people in different sorts of occupations and different sorts of academic sectors, employment sectors, actually navigate menopause at work. In the evidence that we reviewed for the GEO report, overwhelmingly, the data came from women in either professional or managerial roles. But now we're seeing much more research come through from a much more diverse range of occupations and sectors. And I think that's really important, again, to understand that people can be in workplaces where you're not sat at a desk with a laptop. You know, you're out and about, you're peripatetic, you've got to wear a uniform, you're in a busy, noisy, hot factory. And we need to understand all of those things in order to be able to support folk who are going through menopause and struggling with it while they're at work. Something else that we have now, due to some fabulous research that's been done at University College London, which we didn't have in 2016 or 2017, is longitudinal evidence of a strong correlation between problematic menopausal symptoms and either leaving work or reducing hours. So this longitudinal evidence is data that's been collected from the same group of people who were all born in the same week in March 1958. And it gathers data from them at regular intervals through the years, and it's also representative. So it's a really, really robust body of data, this. Not only does it track people over time, but those group of people represent the whole of the UK, if you like. And when the researchers crunched some of the data from this particular data set, what they found was that if at age 50 you have at least one problematic menopausal symptom, you are 43% more likely to have quit your job altogether by the age of 55 and 23% more likely to have lowered your hours. Now, those statistics and other work that's been done on the same data set were quite literally game changing, because up until then, we didn't have robust or reliable academic evidence that there was this correlation. Now, we can't say for sure that symptoms equals leaving work or symptoms equal reducing hours, problematic symptoms at least, but that doesn't seem coincidental to me. And the other thing that really stood out, despite the amazing progress that we've made in this country, and other countries are starting to catch up now, which I'm delighted about, women still do experience a lot of problems at work. So there's a lot of evidence that women still don't disclose to others at work, and others who could make adjustments for them in particular, that they're struggling with their menopausal symptoms. We also see quite a lot of evidence of what I would call overinvestment or carrying a greater burden, because women are fearful that somehow their menopausal symptoms are visible to others and that their performance is affected as a result. So they work even harder to compensate for this perception. We also see quite a lot of evidence of women being subject to performance interventions, for example, around absence levels. And as I've said, we now have very clear-cut evidence that women either leave work altogether or they reduce their hours, or they decide that they're going to take a job that's not as responsible, a job with a less clearly made out career path, or they don't go for promotion, again, to do with the fact that they're struggling with their symptoms. Okay, could you move me on? Thank you. So what we also know, and we knew some of this in 2017 when the GEO report came out, but this is very much more backed by evidence now. So what do we know helps? We know that everybody benefits from clear policies or guidance. So line managers in HR and anyone who's coping with menopausal symptoms at work that are troublesome is really helped and supported by clear policies and clear guidance in terms of what menopause is, how it might affect work, and what can be done to ameliorate that. So we know that that's helpful. We know that that's impactful. And we also know that processes should be redesigned in order to take account of menopause. So, for example, performance review might need to be redesigned to accommodate people who are struggling with particular symptoms. Another example is absence management, because we know that women do take absence because of their menopausal symptoms, but they often don't feel comfortable disclosing why. And the kind of absence that's characteristic of menopause can also be the kind of absence that triggers things like the Bradford score. We also know that a lot of menopausal staff don't realise that they are menopausal and might diagnose themselves with something utterly appalling instead. So good evidence-based advice educates and reassures them. We know that if we train our managers to be more aware and better able and more confident to support menopausal workers, that not only improves their relationship with their team, but it also reduces stigma. And we would also advocate, and the evidence definitely supports this, for awareness raising across the workforce. So everybody knows what menopause is. It's less of a taboo, can have more open conversations about it. And it also normalises anybody asking for support. Next slide, please. Practical workplace adjustments, we also know. So can temperature be lowered? And if it can't, because you're in an open plan office or there's other restrictions, could somebody get a USB desk fan? Or perhaps they could get ice packs for their wrists or their ankles to help reduce problems with hot flushes. I've already talked about uniforms, breathable, non-synthetic, layered uniforms that are easy to wash and manufactured in dark colours, we know help. Flexible working, we also know helps, and there's a whole range of other things. We know that menopause champions or advocates or buddies work really well in the workplace, as does support from peers through things like menopause cafes. So menopause champions and advocates can be excellent resources for menopausal staff who don't feel comfortable telling their line manager or don't feel comfortable telling HR, but they can tell someone who they regard as more of a peer. And these champions and advocates can also help cascade the menopause message, if you like, in a workplace. And then just before I ask for the next slide, I think something else that's really important is that any menopause intervention should really take account of horses for organisational causes. Organisations should really try and understand what is going on in their workplace, structurally and culturally, that might be making menopausal staff's life harder. So you always have to start by asking your workforce what would help them and designing something accordingly, making sure that you've covered all the composite of roles that exist in that organisation, and also being aware that a lot of tweaks that you might make for menopausal staff will benefit others. So, for example, there's a lot of diseases which mean that your body temperature can be hard to regulate. So arthritis is one example. So people with arthritis may really benefit from breathable uniforms the same way that menopausal staff might. Last slide, please. So the general message is the research base is growing. It's growing exponentially. There's more than enough evidence for employers to act, even though it's incomplete. We don't know everything we need to know at the moment, but there is lots and lots and lots of evidence to back up the kind of things that employers and HR and line managers can do to support menopausal staff. And just to finish off, many of you on the call will be aware that the Employment Rights Act, which passed at the end of 2025, means that from April 2027, any employer of 250 or more, which isn't a massive organisation, will have to have a menopause action in place, which is reviewed on an annual basis. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you for the claps.
No, that's fantastic, Jo. And I thank you so much. Whenever I listen to you, I get inspired all over again, because it is
thank you.
It is something that some people just put up with just because, and that's just, and I think the fact that we've got evidence and research and consistency, and it's growing, and it's not a fad or a thing that we did then. It's getting, like you say, it's more and more and more is coming through. I think that actually empowers us all as leaders, managers, people, women, to actually not tolerate poor experiences if organisations listen with fascination to understand, to help, rather than, oh, it's just another one of those menopausal women making a fuss. We get the window open. Oh, it's too cold. Close it for the other person. It's about really giving evidence and research, which is, in the healthcare setting that I come in, it is what drives performance and approaches to things. But actually, that the fact that it's now so embedded in research is so important, and I think we can what's the word I'm looking for? Address this and keep going, knowing it's the right thing to do. And that's why I love to hear you talk. I could.
Oh, bless you.
When I heard before, you could have taken the whole day for me, because there's so much that you could have shared.
I think other people might disagree,
talked
Sarah, but thank you.
No, honestly. So it's fantastic. So if there are any questions, or anybody thinks of any questions that pop into, if you want to pop them in the chat, that's absolutely fine. I know Jo will be happy to answer them out with, or her email address she'll give us as part of the pack, and we'll send that all out. But it's absolutely great. I can see a hand up there. Sorry, just bear with me. I've not got the full screen. Tori, can you help me, because I can't see?
Yeah, Sugar, I think you were first. Thank you.
Yes,
thank you. Thanks, Tori.
Yeah. Actually, I think Joanna, you mentioned something around the influence of legislation and legal cases, and I was just wondering if you wanted to just give a quick example of that. I know it must be so much, because in the workplace, managing performance, and I think a lot of people didn't actually put down their lack of absence from work due to menopause or anything like that. So it's really, if you can elaborate on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a number of employment tribunals in the UK which have succeeded, and we suspect there's many, many more that get settled on the courtroom steps, if you like. But these date back to 2012. So the first successful case was brought on the basis of sex discrimination and unfair dismissal against BT. Quite a remarkable case, and one that I think would hopefully not happen now, because basically the woman who took it, whose surname is Merchant, she had a medical note from her doctor saying that she was really struggling with her menopause, and she'd shared this with her manager, which in 2012 I don't think would have been an easy thing to do. Her performance was dipping, she admitted that, but he knew why, and he saw fit to dismiss her, and he based his reason for dismissal on the fact that his wife had gone through menopause and not struggled, and the HR manager that he worked with to manage the case had gone through menopause and not struggled. Proud to announce now that BT have very much changed their ways, and are now, I think they've been accredited as menopause friendly, actually very different organisation from 13, 14 years ago. Oh, and also what he did went against BT performance policy. So he really got it wrong on so many different levels. All of the cases that have been brought so far have been brought on the basis of the Equality Act. So they've been sex discrimination, age discrimination, disability discrimination. There's also been a couple brought on the basis of harassment. Some of them have been brought wholly on the basis of menopause, like the Merchant one, some partly on the basis of menopause. But these cases are not drying up. This is a very, very big pipeline. There are hundreds brought every year. And I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anybody on the call that, being taken to a tribunal for an employer is not only financially costly, whatever happens, it's financially costly. But if it gets into the public domain, it's also a big hit to your reputation. But that's why, or partly why, we're so pleased that this government have actually seen fit to now make menopause a formal part of the law, because in previous to the ERA being passed, there were ways that people could make the law work for them, so through the Equality Act, for example, but menopause didn't have a status of its own, if you like, and now it does under the ERA. And it's going to be very interesting to see just how the government proposed to monitor this, because they haven't been particularly forthcoming on that one yet. And I think that's going to be really key.
Thanks, Jo. We've got time for one more question. I'll bring Emma Clark in. Emma, I think we've got about 3 minutes if you want to ask your question, and then the rest will go in the chat, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm off mute, aren't I? It feels
Yes.
like ages since I've done an online conference. Thank you so much, Jo. I thought that was really informative. It's just so nice to listen to somebody who is so knowledgeable and passionate on this topic.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm like Sarah, I could listen to you forever. At Western Park, we're just about to fund a specific project where we'll be looking at the management of treatment-induced menopause for women with breast cancer. And I'm just wondering, it's really a plea, if anything, to see whether we can connect with you or any other colleagues in this area. So that would be wonderful.
Very happy to email and chat, Emma. It's worth saying, actually, I'm so glad you said that, because one of the big gaps actually that still exists in the workplace literature is around women whose menopause is induced. So it could be tamoxifen, for example. It could be through a total oophorectomy when you have a hysterectomy. You know, people who are non-menopausal 1 minute and then menopausal the next, what I sometimes call cliff edge menopause. And there is very, very little on that. There is one paper I can think of, which was about cancer survivors, actually, but it was about them going back, you know, generally going back to work. There was little bits about menopause, but only a strand in an overall meta review. So yeah, I'd love to chat. That would be great.
Oh, fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, I will leave you to the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jo. I'm sure we'll be back in touch with you at some point for something else. Thank you. It's been fantastic.